Today I will be painting silver birch logs with Daniel Smith's watercolour sticks on Fabriano 640 GSM watercolour paper. And what we're going to do now is just apply a very light layer of buff titanium to this watercolour paper, just making sure that we catch all of the bumps. Just remember to keep a light hand with this. These are very hard sticks, they're not soft sticks at all. But we just want to keep a very light layer of this because we don't want to fill up the tooth of the paper. So just nice and soft. Try not to go up too close to the edges because when we do apply water to this, the actual paint will spread. So we're just going to go along, continuing blocking in. Not too close to the edge, just nice, light, soft application. And if you've worked with watercolour pencils, then it's the same principles apply. Just going along the second birch here. And continuing to the third. These are very stiff sticks, so they don't actually use up too much of the paint. And now what I'm going to do here is come in with lavender. Just going to go over that, give it a nice coat, just to make the birch a bit more of a creamy grey tone. We don't want to put neutral tint in because that would be a bit too grey, so we need to put in some lavender. And again, back over with the buff titanium, giving that another coat, and that will actually blend in the colours together. Now I'm just going to come in with a Dahlia Rowney size 2 flat brush. This is the sapphire one. And it's synthetic, so the hairs don't blunt. However, being synthetic, it does actually hold the water, so it's excellent for watercolour pencils and watercolour sticks. However, if you don't actually have this brush, then don't worry, just make sure you have a synthetic brush and not a real head brush. I'm just going to play some music now while we carry on. And now we have our layer down. What we need to do now is tidy up all the areas where we may have gone over the edge. Because we're working with sticks, we probably will go over the edge, but that's not a problem as it will actually lift up. And now what we got to do is try and lift up some of the paint from the birch using a cotton wool bud and some kitchen roll. Just lightly dabbing and lifting up the colours just to re-establish all the white areas that we may have lost. So don't worry about it, just do nice random patterns. Don't worry if you lift off too much, it doesn't matter because we will be going over with different colours and also texture. So this is really just the base layer, the first layer we are actually doing. Try not to be too heavy-handed with this. Remember, we are working with paper, so we don't want to ruin our paper at all. Just re-establishing the highlight along the third birch. Once the cotton wool bud is full of paint, what we need to do is get a clean one because we don't want to be reapplying paint on top of paint. What we want to be doing is lifting off paint here. And as you can see, these are non-staining colours, so it's lifting off really well. Just going over each area here. And now I'm just coming back in with a water brush just to remove any excess paint because with these sticks they go over the edge, they're not the tidiest. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create the texture of the bark. So I'm coming in with a raw sienna light, just adding in areas that need to be done. Just nice, loose and light. Just applying light layers where needed. And as you can see, birch normally has quite a lot of colour to it. It's not just white and grey. There is browns and pinks. There's a lot of colours to actually silver birch. So we're just going to go and block it all in. All the brown on the paper layer. Just adding in light layers of raw sienna light. Just remember to keep it nice, loose. Try not to go too close to the edge because when we come in with the water brush, it will actually blend it all the way out. Now coming in with some yellow just to brighten up the areas. Again, keeping it nice and light. Now adding in some burnt amber. Remember, we are creating a brown colour here. So the brown will add in some red to this because it's burnt amber. Nice and light again. A bit more raw sienna light. And last of all, buff titanium. Don't worry if you think you've got it too dark or too light. We won't actually know the colour until we actually apply water to this. Now coming in with a synthetic brush to move all the pigment around. As we've laid down 4 colours, we need a brush that has a synthetic hairs to be able to move the actual pigment around because we need to be quite rough with this. And remember, this is on rough paper as well, so it's very bumpy and we need to blend all the pigments that have caught onto these bumps actually into the paper. And as you can see, now it's working its way around, mixing all these colours. We can actually see that we've got some sort of light brown going on. As I said, with putting colours on top of other colours, we don't know what actually tone we're going to get. We could have ended up with a more of a dark ambery tone, and we would have had to tone it down. We're not too sure until we actually start to dilute the actual sticks up what colours or tones we're actually making. So carrying along, diluting the pigments onto the second birch log now. Just working all the pigments into the paper with a damp brush. Make sure the brush is damp and it's not wet, because we don't want too much water going down, otherwise it will spread. So we just need a damp brush. Going along to the third log. Just wetting the brush and dabbing off on a piece of cloth or a piece of kitchen roll. Just carrying on, diluting. Just make sure we blend all the way up to the edges on this. Just using a damp brush, not a wet brush, because we don't want to make a mess all on our paper. Just blending out, going up to the edges, and if you go over the edges, don't worry, we can just lift it all out. Just keep a nice light hand and damp brush for this. Giving it a quick dry now. And going back in with a second layer of buff titanium, raw sienna light, burnt amber, and also a yellow. Just going over previous layers now, just nice light and loose, nothing too heavy. And yours may need a bit of adjusting too. We don't actually know what colours we're actually making until we actually apply the water, so don't worry if it's not the desired colour. We can always go back in and just re-add the colours that we actually need. Just a bit more burnt amber here. Just remember to keep a light hand with this, because we don't actually want any heavy handed on this, because we just want light pigments put down. We can always readjust for a third time if we need to. But just keep a nice light hand, light pressure, just going over the bumps and grooves. Don't worry about lifting up previous areas, because you won't, or what will happen is they will just merge and blend into each other. Now I'm coming in with some raw sienna light, just to add in some more light brown, just to bump this up a bit. And if you come in with a bit too much like I did here, all what we have to do is just come back in with a damp brush and just blend out, or dab it over and just put it onto our kitchen roll. Just going over areas that need working, that need a bit more brightening up. And as we have actually drawn this on, it's not like paint where we can actually pre-mix our colours up. We're actually using these colours dry on paper, so we don't know what colour we're making or how vibrant or dull it's going to be. So don't worry, because we can always come back in and we can bump up the colours that we need to, just like I have here with the raw sienna light. Just adding it all in, bumping up the colours, just to bring back the light brown to it. And depending on how yours looks, you may not need as much as what I do, you may need more. It really depends on what you're working with. But I'm just coming in now with some more buff titanium, just to add in more buff where I need the areas to be a bit more paler. And just tidy up as we go along, because this isn't painting, it's drawing. So we will go out of the edges, because we're not painting with a paintbrush, we're drawing with a stick. So I find this to be a bit more messier. But however, they do lift off really well. So just come in with your water brush, with a bit of kitchen roll, and just dab off what we don't need. Now just going to do the inner layer of the bark. This is probably the third layer, because we got the paper layer, we got the brown layer. This is the pink layer, so coming in with some quatridone red. Remember, be very light with this, because we don't want red. We're trying to create a light pink, so it's really light-handed work here that we're trying to do. And just go in wherever you see this colour. Applying some buff titanium just to blend in the red. Don't worry about being too hard with the buff titanium, that's fine. Just try and be light with all the other colours. Coming in with some lavender. Some orange. This one's permanent orange coming in with. Now coming in with some neutral tint. So be careful with neutral tint because it is a very, very dark colour. So this is just to tone down the pink, the reds. But yeah, just be very light-handed with this one. And adding in some more buff. Now we're just going to come in with a synthetic brush, just mixing up all these 4 colours. And as you can see, I've put down a little bit too much of the neutral tint here, and it has darkened up my colour quite a lot. This is why I said be very, very careful with the neutral tint because it is such a dark colour. And as we lay down all these colours, we don't actually know what we're mixing here. It's just a rough gist. So just blending this, and as you can see, this has gone a little bit darker. So I'm just lifting out the colour, just trying to make this a bit more lighter, just going over, blending out with the brush again. Just trying to blend in that neutral tint. But if you've done exactly the same as me, don't worry about it. This is bark, so it's unique. We can always change things. I'm just coming in now with some more buff titanium, just dulling the colour down as I need it to be. And just going over other areas that we've laid down this colour. And as you can see, I've gone a bit too bright again here. And you may have done the same, but don't worry, we can readjust this. These colours will actually lift up, so they aren't actually staining colours, they do lift up. So if you lift up the whole lot of these colours, don't worry, just go over with the hairdryer and we can just lay these colours down again. Just going in, diluting on the 3rd birch now, adding in some more buff titanium, and it's really handy to keep 2 of the buff titanium sticks. One that we can use dry and another one that we can use when we need to apply more buff titanium with the brush. So we have one wet stick and one dry stick. Just continuing lifting out colours, re-establishing all the highlights of the birch now. Just trying to keep things nice and tidy here, that we don't actually get too messy. And I'm just using a water brush here, other than a normal brush. And as you can see, everything's starting to form. It's all just a blur of colours at the moment. Nothing will actually resemble birch logs until we actually get all the details on. So don't worry about if yours looks really messy or untidy, it's supposed to look like that. Just reapplying some more raw sienna light here where I've actually lifted up a bit too much colour. Just blending back out. And as I said, these are non-staining colours, so they do lift out, and if we lift out too much, we just add a bit more back in. Just blending out now with my brush. Now what we're going to do here is create the darker bark with a bit of raw sienna light and burnt amber. Just coming in with straight raw sienna light at the moment, just to establish those parts. So these sticks are quite versatile, that you can actually use them with a brush for painting and for the finer detailed work, because we couldn't draw this on. Just refining areas now, getting a bit more pickier of where we want things to be. Always bumping up the colours and readjusting and changing. Nothing set in stone where, you know, you can't change the colours because you can, or where you can't lift it up, because you can always change things. They're not permanent. And just redrawing with these now. Just building up all the layers, all the textures. And what we're doing here is we are creating the grayer part of the birch bark. So just applying the colours where the grey areas are with raw sienna light. Very light-handed, because here we are mixing up 6 colours. So be very light-handed with all of these colours. Don't go in too heavy. We can always readjust these. So very light pressure, just going over the grain. Continuing on to the third log now. Be random with it. Don't be very tight with yourself. Be quite loose. Now we're coming in with yellow here, which is a bit of a strange colour you would assume to put in, but it's a colour that's required. A bit of cerulean blue. Very light-handed. Just going over the areas here. Very light-handed with all of these. Adding in some burnt amber. Because remember, we are doing logs here, so the amber just helps with the wood effect. A light touch of neutral tint. Remember, a light touch with this one. And last of all, going over with the buff. Always use a buff last because it's the lightest colour here. So that's all 6 colours laid down. Remember, don't go too heavy-handed with this. We can always come back in a second time. And now what we're going to do is blend all these colours together. Make sure your brush is damp and not soaking wet for this. Just applying a bit of pressure here to all the areas that we've actually covered. And as you can see, as we start blending, we can see where we need to readjust these colours. Bump these colours up, make them a bit more darker, a bit more grayer. So a bit more neutral tint is going over at the moment. Applied a bit more raw sienna light. A bit more buff titanium. And just blending out with the synthetic brush. Here I've used a flat synthetic brush. You may want to use a filbert, but I wouldn't suggest use a round brush. Always try and use a flat brush. Just blending up all these 6 colours here, and as you can see, they do blend really well. And if you've ever used watercolor pencils, it's the same principle. It's exactly the same. So just blending, diluting and changing colour tones. On to the third log now. And yours may have more grey on it, it may not have as much. But if you look at birch, then you will notice it's not just grey and white. There are a lot of other colours involved with it. Just going over to the third now. And at the moment, it's just a clump of colours. It doesn't resemble anything. It doesn't look like anything. And it's not meant to, not until the end. These are just all the underlayers, all the base layers, all the different layers of bark that are actually on the birch. Just giving it a good dry over and coming in again. Just trying to make this a bit more darker. So we're going over again with cerulean blue. Just trying to make it a bit more darker than last time, because we're never going to hit it off straight off. If we are, then we're very lucky. Light hand of neutral tint. Back in with some burnt amber. Just remember to keep a very light hand and loose with this. And blending back out again with the brush. Just trying to get this as grey as we need it to be. Maybe you was lucky and you hit it off first. Maybe yours isn't as dark as what it should have been, just like mine. Maybe yours is a bit more bluer. It's really just a matter of placing down colours and readjusting. And we can mix it all on the paper. We don't need a palette for this. We can just mix as we go on the paper. Just adding in some more buff now, just to tone areas down. And as you can see, these colours do mix up really quite nicely as we lay down 6 colours straight, and they blend out really good. Don't worry about blending out too far, because these colours do actually blend out quite a way. So this is why I said try not to go up to the edges, because these will blend out. And don't worry about it being a bit messy. Maybe you're a bit more over the edges. This is sticks and you can lift out like what I'm doing now. We're not painting, we are drawing with quite chunky sticks here. So they do get a bit messy. They do go out of the lines. This is why we need to come back in and tidy up as much as we can, because we are dealing with sticks here. We're not dealing with a paintbrush and painting. So your edges will be a bit messy. But just lift out where you need to. Blend out, adjust things. Go along and try and work out, where you want things to be a bit more darker. Maybe you want things to be a bit more lighter in areas. Maybe you want to lift out the grey because you've put it down and you don't like it and you want to take it out. And that's not a problem. These are all non-staining colours. They lift up, just apply a damp brush, get your kitchen roll and just lift out what you don't want. So now we're just going to tidy up all the areas before we actually create the brown bark. So now I'm coming in with some burnt amber, some buff titanium and some raw sienna light. This is creating the reddy brown part of the bark. Just applying it in the corners and areas I need to, as well as tidying up areas. Just a light hand here of raw sienna light. Just establishing those brown areas that we're going to have with our bark. And this is the inner part of the bark. Just going over with buff. And as I said, with buff titanium, you can go in heavy with that. It's not a problem. It will just blend in the colours. And a lot of this will actually be wet into wet work here. Just going in now with a bit more raw sienna light. A little bit more burnt amber, as we're actually now working on the brown part of the bark. Making sure we actually keep this a bit dry now because we don't want to smudge everything. Just going in with some burnt amber, just drawing this on. Bit more of the raw sienna light. And a bit of neutral tint, very light, remember. And blending out with our brush. Just establishing those areas and bumping up those areas with a bit more burnt amber. And we're going to be painting this on really. With the small areas, they're a bit more harder to draw, so we just go in with a wet brush and just dab it onto our water stick and apply that way. Just going bit at a time, not too much. Adding in some neutral tint now. These are just going to darken up the areas where the shadow is. And just bumping up, refining everything, making bits stand out. And just taking our time as we go along. Just making sure that the paper actually still stays wet here, so it will all blend out evenly. And just bumping up the burnt amber and a neutral tint now. Just going in with a bit of everything. A bit of raw sienna light just to lighten the areas, because raw sienna light is a very light brown, so this will just bring back the light part to the bark. Just continuing with the edges now with a bit of burnt amber and some neutral tint. And this is actually a flat brush, so it's quite good for all that work. Just making sure our edges are tidy, straightening stuff up. And then we're just going to give this a good once over with a hairdryer just to make sure everything is dry before we go on to the next stage. And now I'm coming in with a cotton wool bud here. So we want a cotton wool bud that's damp. And we just want to lift off areas because we've lost the white now. So we need to get back some more of the white areas. And as you can see, by using a damp cotton wool and some kitchen roll, the colours do actually lift off really well. So it's very forgiving this. So if you have gone wrong in any area, don't worry about it, because as you can see, we can lift off colours back to the white now. And as soon as the cotton wool is full of paint, then just put it to one side, grab a new one, and just continue working, lifting off the areas and dabbing dry. And you may need more white areas, you may not. But as I said, this is very forgiving, non-staining colours. So as you see, everything does lift off. Even the dark grey areas will lift off as well. At the moment, all this is just a bunch of colours put on top of each other. It's all just the base colours, all the underlayers that we need. And just re-establishing those highlights, tidying up areas. Just try and get as much of the white areas up as you need to now. This is the final part of the blending of all the colour mixing on the paper. So make sure we've got everything in place all the whites up, all the darks in the right places that we need them to be. Just adding in a bit more dark here. And then we're going to give this a quick once over with the hairdryer to make sure everything's dry before we continue on to the next stage. And what we're going to do next is start our detailed work. We are just making sure everything's neat and tidy now, everything's dry. So we're just going to come in with a size 2 brush here, add a little bit of the grey mix that we previously made up on our paper, and just try to re-establish some more of the greys. Coming in with also a bit of burnt amber just to re-establish the details with a size 2 brush, because the synthetic one is too large, so we need to come in with detail work now. Just getting into all the corners with burnt amber, and it's not a problem, we can still do this with our watercolour sticks. All what we need to do is just wet the end of the watercolour stick and just lift off with our brush and just apply it to the paper. And what we're going to do now is create all the texture. So this is a mix of neutral tin and burnt amber, which is made up on the palette. So we just need to make sure the ends of our stick are wet and just put it onto our palette, and paint will soon lift off, and we can just mix that way with our sticks. Now we want quite a thick mix for this and a dry brush, so we don't want to wet our brush here. This is a flat brush. It's actually a bristle brush. It was a round one that I decided to cut the tip off to make it flat, and I've just gone into the paint mix and dabbed it off on some kitchen roll just to make it drier. And what we're going to do is we're just going to apply this to the paper, just brushing it upwards, but make sure it is dry and it's not wet, because we just want to catch the tops of the paper, of the grain here. And remember, this is rough paper here, so it is very textured. And we're just going to bump up this dark now with a bit more neutral tint. It's just lifting up, making sure we don't apply too much paint, too much wet paint. And if we have, don't worry about that, we can just remove that later. But we're just going along here now, just creating all the texture work. This is why I said beforehand that we need to make sure we got all our base layers incorrect, and that we don't want to adjust anything else, because once we've done this stippling, this is really the final part. We don't want to be lifting this up now. And as you can see, there's a few blobs here, which will bound to happen if you've done exactly the same. It's not a problem. We just come in with a wet brush and we can just lift those off later. Now coming in with a size 2 brush and some burnt amber and some buff titanium mix here. Just running in these little lines that we find in birch. Just remember just to keep these random and loose, just to make it give it more of a natural feel. And just run down the brush hairs. Not too hard, not too heavy-handed. And now we can just lift up areas here that maybe got a bit too clumpy. As I said, we can just lightly remove areas here, but just be very, very careful, and obviously try to re-establish all the bark so they are individual and it doesn't look like one long piece of wood. So just bear that in mind, that we want everything to look individual. And coming back in now with some burnt amber and some neutral tint, just adding to the lighter marks, just making them a bit more darker. Not all of them, just a few here, there and everywhere. Just try and make it look as random as you can. Just going in, creating some little dots now, because bark has a lot of texture. You got the bumpy texture, you got the little lines, and then there's also all these little dots as well. So just adding those in, just as much texture and variety as we can get. And don't rush this, just take your time, there's no hurry. Working up on the amber now. Just adding in a bit more of the neutral tint. Just trying to get more of a shadow in that. And as you can see, it's starting to look like silver birch logs now. Now that we've got a texture in, it's starting to come together. Just carrying on making these look individual, making more highlights, tidying up areas. And you can always change as you go. If you decide that you want something a bit more lighter, put it in. If you want something a bit more darker, just add a bit more dark to it. This is your piece of work, you just do what you want to do with it. Now we're just going to create the core now. I'm going in with some buff titanium, some raw sienna light, a bit more buff titanium just to blend it in. And again with our synthetic brush here just to blend things out. And don't worry if you've gone too heavy-handed, we can always remove this. And as you see, we can also adjust this by adding in some more buff titanium. Just make sure we keep one wet and one dry. Going in with a bit more neutral tint now, just to darken it up. And I've gone a little bit darker here, so all I need to do is go in with a bit more buff, and we can just mix on the paper here. We don't need a palette to do it. Just readjust, add in more areas, and if it's wrong then we can just go in with a kitchen towel and lift off. Take away some of the excess paint and blend out again, add more colours. I've added in here a bit more of raw sienna light. Just blending that out, add in a bit more of the buff titanium. And working on the third log here. Remember to keep these individual and try and keep it a different tone. Add in a bit more buff. And add in a bit more yellow now, just to brighten things up. Not too much, just a tiny bit. Giving this a good dry before we continue on to the next part now. And just coming in with some raw sienna light, just trying to create the edge of the bark now to separate the actual core from the bark. Just drying as we go along here because we don't want anything actually merging into each other. And back in with our size 2 brush now with some burnt amber, just doing the fine details, a bit hit and miss here. Just run it down nice and slowly. And also here, nice fine line, so we want a sharp point on our brush. And try and use a small brush here to do this work. We don't want a large brush here because we're trying to create the edging. Just coming back in now, just touching up. Making sure this actually fully dries before we actually put in the detail on the wood. I'm just going to come in with a size 2 brush with some raw sienna light, some buff titanium, a bit of neutral tint, just to create the grain in this wood. And just wetting the brush and just blending out now, making sure we haven't got any harsh lines. And we're going to do exactly the same for the third. Just creating the lines, the textures, and blending out as we go, applying the paint and blending out. And now we're going to come back in with our shadow mix, which is a mix of quatridone red, cerulean blue and neutral tint. As we can see, these Daniel Smith watercolour sticks are really versatile. Whether we want to use them dry or whether we want to use them wet, we can use them however we want to use them, just as well as what we could with watercolour paint.